The gunshot cracked across the valley before sunrise. Sheriff Wyatt Colton was already awake. He always was, these days. Sleep had stopped coming easy to him 3 winters back, and he'd learned not to fight it. He stood at his window in his shirt sleeves, coffee cooling in his hand, watching the mist roll off Miller's Creek. Somewhere out past the tree line, a horse screamed. He set the cup down without finishing it. Boots on. Gun belt. Hat. By the time he reached the stable, half the town of Willow Bend was already gathered outside Hollis Granger's fence, lanterns swinging in the gray light. She took the gray mare, Hollis said, pointing a shaking finger toward the ridge. Rode off not 20 minutes ago. Nearly ran my boy down doing it. Wyatt looked where the man pointed. Fresh tracks cut deep into the mud, heading north, toward the rocks. He repeated. You saw her? Plain as I'm seeing you. Woman on a stolen horse, moving like the devil, was behind her. Wyatt didn't ask more questions. Questions could wait. He saddled his own horse, a steady bay gelding named Samson, and rode out before the sun cleared the hills. Willow Bend was a small town. The kind of town where everyone knew whose fence needed mending and whose crop had failed. A place built on trust, because there wasn't enough law to go around otherwise. Wyatt had been sheriff here for 6 years. Before that, he'd been something else. A husband. A father. He didn't let himself finish that thought most mornings, and this one was no different. He rode hard along the ridge, following tracks that grew more frantic the farther he went. Not the tracks of someone stealing for profit. Tracks of someone running. He noticed that. He filed it away and kept riding anyway. He found her an hour later, at the mouth of a dry wash where the gray mare had gone lame on loose shale. She was young. Younger than he expected. Dark hair loose from its pins, dress torn at the hem, hands raw from gripping the reins too tight for too long. She stood between him and the horse like she meant to fight him with nothing but her own body. And behind her, half hidden in the rocks, was a boy. Small. Maybe 5, maybe 6. Wrapped in a blanket too big for him, eyes wide and dry, like he'd already used up all his crying somewhere back down the road. Wyatt raised a hand, slow, the way he would around a spooked animal. Ma'am. I'm going to need you to step away from the horse. It's not stolen, she said. Her voice shook, but her eyes didn't. Please. Just let us go. That horse belongs to Hollis Granger. He says otherwise. Hollis Granger doesn't know what he's talking about. Wyatt studied her a long moment. There was something in the way she said the name. Not fear exactly. Something closer to disgust. What's your name? She hesitated. Sarah. Sarah what? Just Sarah. Behind her, the boy shifted, and for the first time, he spoke. His voice was small and cracked from cold. Are you gonna hurt her? Wyatt looked at the child. Something about the question landed harder than it should have. No, son. Nobody's going to hurt anybody. He didn't believe himself completely, and he suspected the woman didn't either. He brought them back to town before noon, the woman riding the lame mare at a slow walk beside his horse, the boy seated in front of her, small hands fisted in the animal's mane. She didn't try to run again. That told him something too, though he wasn't ready yet to say what. Willow Bend's jail was one room with 2 cells, a stove that never drew right, and a window that looked out on Main Street. Wyatt put her in the cell nearest the door, the one with better light, though he couldn't have explained why that mattered to him. The boy wouldn't leave her side. He sat on the floor outside the bars, knees pulled to his chest, watching Wyatt the way a stray dog watches a stranger who might have food or might have a boot. He's got nowhere else to go, the woman said quietly. Sarah, if that was even her name. Please. Whatever you decide about me, let him stay warm. Wyatt looked at the boy a long moment. Then he pulled a second blanket from the shelf behind his desk and set it on the floor within the child's reach, close enough to take, far enough that the boy would have to choose to. The boy took it. Word traveled fast in a town that small. By supper time, half of Willow Bend had an opinion about the horse thief in the jailhouse, and most of them were certain of her guilt before they'd laid eyes on her. Hollis Granger came by twice to make sure she was still behind bars. The preacher's wife came by once, just to look, and left without a word. Wyatt sat at his desk long after dark, doing paperwork he didn't need to do, listening to the quiet sounds from the cell. The boy's breathing, slow and even, finally asleep. The woman's, still awake, still guarded. Around midnight, she spoke. "You don't believe I stole that horse?" It wasn't a question. Wyatt set down his pen. "I believe Hollis Granger thinks you did." "That's not the same thing." "No," he admitted. "It isn't." She was quiet a moment, watching him through the bars the way he'd been watching her. "Why do you care what I think you believe?" Wyatt didn't have a good answer for that. He'd asked himself the same question twice already that day. "Man in my position needs to know what he's dealing with," he said finally. "That's all." She almost smiled. "Almost. You're a bad liar, Sheriff." He didn't argue. He was nearly asleep in his chair near 2 in the morning when the boy's voice broke the silence, thin and half-dreaming. "Mama." Wyatt's eyes opened. The boy hadn't stirred. Still curled beneath the blanket, still lost somewhere in sleep. But the word hung in the dark jailhouse like something that couldn't be taken back. Wyatt looked at the woman. She hadn't moved either. But her face, lit only by the low stove fire, had gone the color of old ash, and her hands, steady all day, steady through the ride, steady through the accusations, were trembling now against the bars. "Ma'am," Wyatt said slowly, sitting forward. "Is that boy?" "Don't," she whispered. "Please. Not tonight." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the jailhouse window in its frame. Wyatt sat in the dark a long while, watching a woman he'd arrested for horse thievery hold perfectly still beside a sleeping child who had just called her something no stranger's child should call her. He didn't know her name. He didn't know her story. But he knew, sitting there in the stovelight and the cold, that whatever he thought he understood about the woman in his jail cell had just come apart in his hands. He just didn't yet know why. He just didn't yet know why. Morning came slow and gray, the kind of light that made the whole town look tired. Wyatt hadn't slept. He sat at his desk with a cup of coffee gone cold twice over, watching the woman braid the boy's hair with fingers that hadn't stopped trembling since the night before. He waited until the boy had eaten the last of the biscuit he'd brought them, until the child had curled up again under the blanket to doze in the thin morning sun through the window. Then he pulled a chair close to the bars. "His name," Wyatt said quietly. "Not yours. His." She looked at the boy a long moment before answering. "Eli. And yours?" She let out a breath that seemed to carry something heavy with it. "Ruth. Not Sarah." Wyatt didn't comment on the lie. He only nodded, like a man accepting a gift he hadn't expected to be handed. "Ruth," he said. "Tell me about the horse." She told it slow, in pieces, the way people talk when they've spent a long time learning not to trust anyone with the truth. The mare wasn't stolen. It was hers. Had been hers since her husband died 2 winters back, a wedding gift from him before the fever took him. But her husband's father, a rancher named Silas Bragg, had never accepted the marriage, and he liked even less the idea of his only grandson being raised by a woman he'd never wanted in his family. He said if I ever tried to leave with Eli, he'd see me hang for a thief before I made it past the county line, Ruth said. I didn't believe him. Not really. Not until Hollis Granger's man came asking after a gray mare that matched mine, 3 days after I left. Wyatt sat back slowly. Granger works for Bragg? Granger owes Bragg money. Enough money that he'll say whatever he's told to say. Outside, a wagon rattled past on Main Street. Wyatt watched it go, turning the pieces over in his mind, feeling them settle into a shape he didn't like. That's a serious accusation, Ruth. So is calling a mother a horse thief to take her son from her, she said, and for the first time, her voice cracked clean down the middle. Eli stirred at the sound, but didn't wake. By afternoon, Wyatt had ridden out to Hollis Granger's place with no company but his own suspicion. He found the man mending fence, sweating despite the cold, and something in the way Granger's hands went still at the sight of him told Wyatt everything he needed before a word was spoken. "Mr. Bragg know I'm the one you sent for?" Wyatt asked, dismounting. Granger's jaw worked, but no sound came out at first. "I don't know what you're talking about, Sheriff. You said she was riding hard, like the devil was behind her. Question is, Hollis, which devil?" Granger set down his hammer. For a long moment, the only sound was wind moving through dead cornstalks. "Bragg's got half this county in his pocket," Granger finally said, low, like the words cost him something. "You go against him, Sheriff, you're going against every debt he's ever called in. Every favor he's ever bought. That a threat? That's a fact." Granger wouldn't meet his eyes. The mare's not even mine to claim. Never was. Bragg told me what to say and I said it. Wyatt swung back up onto Samson without another word. There wasn't anything left worth saying to a man who'd sell a mother's freedom for a debt. But riding back toward town, he understood the shape of the thing now, and the shape of it was worse than horse thieving. He hadn't counted on Bragg arriving before he did. 3 riders stood outside the jailhouse when Wyatt returned, horses lathered from hard riding, and at the center of them, a broad man in a black coat that looked too fine for a cattle ranch, silver-headed cane resting across his saddle horn like a weapon he hadn't decided yet whether to use. Silas Bragg. Wyatt had met him twice before, both times at a distance. Up close, the man's eyes were pale and flat, the eyes of someone who'd never once in his life had to ask for anything twice. "Sheriff," Bragg said, not bothering to dismount. "I understand you've got something of mine in that jail." "I've got a woman I arrested on a theft complaint," Wyatt said. "Nothing that belongs to you. The boy belongs to me. His mother's an unfit thief who ran off in the night with property that isn't hers. County judge in Redmont owes me a favor or two. I expect this'll be settled quick and quiet." Wyatt felt something go cold and still inside his chest, the way it used to before a gunfight. "Nothing gets settled till I say it's settled, Mr. Bragg. This is my town." Bragg smiled, and it wasn't a kind thing to see. "For now," he said. "Everything's yours for now, Sheriff. Things change." He turned his horse without waiting for a reply, his men falling in behind him, and rode off down Main Street like a man who already believed he'd won. That night, Wyatt didn't go home. He sat outside the cell instead, on the floor across from Eli, who'd finally worked up the courage to sit closer to the bars than he had the day before. "You like horses?" Wyatt asked. Eli nodded slow, studying him with the careful eyes of a child who'd learned that adults weren't always safe to trust. "Samson's gentle," Wyatt said. "Once this is sorted, maybe you'll get to meet him proper." "Is the mean man gonna take me?" The question landed harder than Wyatt expected. He looked past the boy to Ruth, who'd gone very still. "No," Wyatt said, and meant it more than he'd meant anything in a long while. "Not while I've got breath in me." Ruth's eyes glistened in the low firelight, but she didn't speak. She reached instead through the bars and rested her hand briefly against Wyatt's arm, a small thing, barely a touch, gone as quick as it came. But it stayed with him longer than it should have. He woke before dawn to the sound of hooves, many hooves, moving fast, moving purposeful, coming from the direction of the Bragg ranch. Wyatt was at the window before his boots were fully laced. Riders. A dozen at least, maybe more, torches burning against the dark despite the hour, cutting across the open field toward town like a line of fire drawn straight for the jailhouse door. Behind him, Ruth had risen too, Eli clutched against her chest, her face gone the color of the frost on the window glass. "He said he'd wait for the judge," she whispered. "He said." "He lied," Wyatt said flatly, already reaching for his rifle off the wall. The torches kept coming, closer now, close enough that Wyatt could make out Bragg's black coat at the head of the riders, could hear the man's voice carrying ahead of the horses like something already certain of the outcome. "Sheriff Colton." Bragg's voice rang out across the frozen street. "Open that door and hand over what's mine, and nobody in this town needs to get hurt tonight." Wyatt looked once at Ruth. Once at the boy, small and silent and clinging to his mother's neck like he already understood, somewhere deep and wordless, exactly what was coming. Then he looked at the door, and the 12 riders beyond it, and the one lawman standing between them. He checked his rifle. "Get behind the stove," he said quietly. "And don't come out no matter what you hear." Outside, the torches kept coming. Outside, the torches kept coming. Wyatt stepped onto the jailhouse porch alone, rifle low but ready, and stood in the cold morning dark facing 12 riders and the man who owned every one of their debts. "Last chance, Sheriff," Bragg called from his saddle. "Step aside." "You've got no warrant," Wyatt said, voice steady though his heart wasn't. "No judge's order. Nothing but a lie you paid a desperate man to tell. I've got 12 men and you've got one rifle." "You've got 12 men who took your money," Wyatt said. "Doesn't mean they took your lie." He let that sit in the cold air a moment, and he watched it land. A few of the riders shifted in their saddles. One, a younger man near the back, wouldn't meet Bragg's eyes when the old rancher turned to glare down the line. That was when the second set of hooves arrived. Hollis Granger came riding hard down Main Street, hatless, coat flapping open, shouting before he'd even reined in. "Sheriff! Sheriff, I got something you need to hear, I got something they all need to hear." He pulled up hard beside the porch, chest heaving, and turned to face the line of riders like a man finally setting down a weight he'd carried too long. "There wasn't no theft," Granger said, loud enough to carry down the frozen street, loud enough that doors were beginning to creak open along the row of houses, faces appearing in windows. "That mare belonged to her free and clear. Mr. Bragg paid me to say otherwise. Paid me to lie a mother into a jail cell so he could take her boy." Silence dropped over the street like snow. Bragg's face went the color of old iron. "You'll regret that, Granger." "Already regret plenty," Granger said, and didn't look away. The jailhouse door creaked open behind Wyatt. He didn't turn, he couldn't, not with 12 riders still watching him, but he heard Ruth's footsteps on the porch boards, felt Eli's small hand find its way into his own free one, gripping tight. "Mrs. Bragg," the old rancher said, voice softer now, almost pleading in a way Wyatt hadn't expected from him. "Come home. Bring the boy. This doesn't have to go further." Ruth's voice, when it came, didn't shake at all. "He's not property, Silas. He's my son. He was your son's son, and you let your son marry me, and then you let him die alone in a fever bed while you stood in the doorway too proud to hold his hand. I won't let you raise Eli in that same pride." The words hit harder than any gunshot could have. For a long moment, Bragg said nothing. His pale eyes moved from Ruth, to the boy gripping Wyatt's hand, to the dozen men behind him who no longer looked eager to spend their morning on his war. Then Eli spoke, small and clear in the cold silence. "I don't want to go with you," he said. "I want to stay with Mama and the sheriff." Something in Bragg's face broke then, not surrender exactly, but something close enough to it. An old man realizing, all at once, the true size of what his pride had already cost him. He looked at the boy a long moment. Then, without another word, he turned his horse. His riders followed, torches guttering out one by one as they rode back toward the ranch and the gray coming dawn. Granger stayed behind long enough to give a full statement, signed and witnessed, laying out every lie Bragg had paid him to tell. By noon, word had already spread through Willow Bend the way word always did, faster than truth usually deserved to travel, but this time, at least, it was carrying the right story. The preacher's wife came by the jailhouse again that afternoon. This time she brought a warm pie and an apology, and stayed long enough to hold Eli on her knee while Ruth finally slept. Wyatt sat outside on the porch steps in the thin winter sun, rifle set aside, watching the street he'd sworn to protect settle back into its ordinary rhythms, wagons, dogs, children chasing each other past the general store. He thought about his own boy, gone 3 winters now, and the wife who'd gone with him. He thought about how long he'd told himself the ache would never make room for anything else. He found, sitting there, that it had made a little room after all. Weeks passed. Ruth didn't leave Willow Bend. There was nowhere safer to go, and, though neither of them said it plainly for a long while, nowhere either of them wanted to be instead. She took in mending to earn her keep. Eli learned the names of every horse in the county, spent his afternoons trailing after Wyatt on his rounds, small boots stamping to match the sheriff's longer stride. Wyatt taught him how to saddle Samson properly. How to sit a horse without gripping too tight. How silence, sometimes, said more than words ever could. One evening in early spring, Wyatt fixed the loose porch step outside the little house Ruth had rented at the edge of town, fixed it before he ever got around to fixing his own back at the jailhouse, though he didn't think much of that at the time. Ruth watched him from the doorway, arms crossed against the evening chill, something soft in her face that hadn't been there the night he'd first found her at the mouth of that dry wash. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "Wanted to," Wyatt said, testing the step with his boot until it held firm. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Late that summer, on a warm evening with the sun going gold over the fields, Eli ran laughing across the open grass behind the little house, chasing a barn cat that had no intention of being caught, his voice carrying bright and unafraid across the whole quiet valley. On the porch, 2 chairs sat side by side, worn smooth by seasons and use. Wyatt sat in one. Ruth in the other. Between them, an old cowboy hat rested on the porch rail, and beside it, tucked into a chipped clay jar, a small handful of fresh wildflowers Eli had picked that morning and refused to let anyone else carry home. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The sun went down slow and gold over Willow Bend, and somewhere in that quiet gold light, a boy's laughter drifted across the grass, the sound of a family that had found its way home, one porch step at a time.